All right, welcome to the Lightbox panel for Retro Comics New Look with our special guest, Jim Rugg, sponsored in part by Sketchboard Pro. Had to mention that. But my name is JJ Harrison. I'm an illustrator, an artist. I worked in comics and publishing, do a lot of stuff for Cartoon Network and Mondo. And Jim Rugg, you should be familiar with his work, but I'll let him introduce himself.
I am a cartoonist. I've been making comic books for about 20 years. Some of my comics are Street Angel, Aphrodisiac, The Plain Janes, Super Mag. I'm also a YouTuber. With Ed Piskor, I do Cartoonist Kayfabe. We've been posting videos about comics, making comics, interviewing cartoonists for a couple of years, and we've been doing them daily. So if you're not a Cartoonist Kayfabe subscriber already, please do that.
Yeah, I hope they do. It's a great channel. So yeah, when I got the opportunity to do some panels for Lightbox, that your name was one of the first to hit me, because I've always wanted to pick your brain. I haven't had the opportunity to meet up with you at a con, and you know, I love to. I don't know that I mentioned it to you. I love that you're wearing a pink shirt, because you know I was just about finished with college, like 20 something years ago, it seems like. And I walk into my comic shop and I'm looking at the indie rack, and this pink book is on the shelf, and it just like stood out. Like I was like, what is this? And it had this kid, looked like they were like kick flipping over this doctor dude. And I was just so drawn to it, and immediately became one of my favorite titles. It was so well written, so funny, and the art's amazing. And
that is
from
awesome.
then on, I was just following Jim Rugg. Like from that day on, like it was, I'm, you know, had to model everything I was doing in terms of like, how does he do this style? What is that? What is that like? And not too long after, you came out with this book, Aphrodisiac. And in this one, I mean, we were already living in an era where people were mostly kind of printing digitally, and you know, a lot of comics were being made digitally. And it struck me with this book how much painstaking effort you must have put in to get this really vintage process look to it. And because I had to imagine, you know, you did it in Photoshop or some other program. But yeah, I just wanted to pick your brain about that process and see like what draws you to, because it seems like a thread that's kind of carried throughout your career, that you like to revisit stuff from, you know, the good old days.
I don't know if they were good or not, but you know, those are nevertheless, that's my history. That's the, you know, the stuff that I grew up reading and watching. So good or bad, that's what influenced me. And I do go back to that. But the reason Aphrodisiac is colored the way it is, as you guessed, you know, that is all digital coloring, even though it may look like an old comic book from the 70s. It's because color was becoming cheaper to print. And a lot of the books that were being colored digitally, they had like a plastic perfect quality to them, to the way the color and the gradients were applied. And it wasn't what I loved about comics. You know, I grew up reading comics on newsprint that were all yellow and the colors were bright and kind of garish. But again, that's the stuff that I fell in love with. And so whenever comics started to become, you know, the color was an option for an indie cartoonist, I needed to figure out how to do color. And Aphrodisiac was based on the old coloring processes, you know, like going into CMYK. Right. For anybody unfamiliar, comics used to be colored and printed in CMYK, but the color palette was limited. There were like 64 colors, and they were all based on 25% variations of CM and Y. Black wouldn't have been mixed with those, you know, that would have just been the line art on top. Right. So it was really easy to recreate that color palette, that original color palette. And you could go into Photoshop in their channels, you know, if you were coloring in CMY and CMYK, and you could manipulate those channels individually. And so I would create color halftones, I would move registration, and basically beat those things up to kind of see, like, could I bring texture and like a tactile quality to digital coloring? And that was a lot of what inspired that approach with Aphrodisiac. And Aphrodisiac, for anyone unfamiliar, it's composed of a lot of short stories. They would run in anthologies, you know, four pages here, 8 pages there. And it was just trial and error the way I was coloring. So I would color one story and maybe make an accident and think like, oh, I could use that. So the next story, there's probably half a dozen different approaches to color. One of the first ones that I did to give some process is I would scan old comic books. I would find like, flesh tone or something. And I would scan the biggest piece I could find. And then I would copy and kind of paste it and make like a whole page worth of what would be like skin tone or blue, like for a sky or, all the colors that I could build. And I would have many fewer than 64, but it would all be based on like that original, like found color samples. I was sampling essentially, and then I could just fill in areas and it'd be like green. This is like comic book green, but it was coming from actual comics. So I would have like the newsprint tooth. A lot of that printing is very imperfect. I used to say like, that's selling the lie. Like you have to put the imperfections into the digital process if you want it to look analog. If you want it to have that kind of warm human hand quality, those are the mistakes. I can do a perfect grid or I could do a perfect gradation or anything. I want it to look like, from one human to another, especially in the case of Aphrodisiac that did have, it was set in the 70s and early 80s. And so I was trying to approximate that look. The other thing that I would do with two other things is color the black line. There were people that were doing like a retro color at that time in comics, and often it would fall flat whenever you would see like a perfect black line on top of this like retro textured color. And I realized like you could create a layer mask and you could then manipulate the black line. And I would do the same thing, add some newsprint, add some noise, beat that up a little bit, and it would sort of integrate really well then with the colors and the line art. And, the last thing was just observation. I could scan comic book panels, and I could scan them at like 1600% and look at these pages really closely. I was a fan of the designer Chip Kidd, who has done several books about comics or, kind of featuring some comic element. And he would work with a photographer and he would actually photograph the comics. And sometimes it would just be a blown up panel, maybe a 2-page spread, like blown up 20 or 30 times the original size, but it would reveal like the wood chips in the newsprint. It would reveal all of these things. And I could do the same thing. I could scan these pages or panels and really look at them closely. And once I did, then it was just trying to emulate what I was seeing, even like making the screen tones, the dots gain. I would do things like I would print out my color separations. So I would have the yellow plate, and it was just the black dots and everything. I would print it out very small, and then I would scan that and enlarge it 8 or 10 times, because that would be like the bleed on the paper, which was really hard. I couldn't fake the bleed on the paper of the dots, but I could sort of make the dots bleed on paper and then scan that and bring it back in. So it was whatever I could come up with, and scanning a lot of stuff, scanning newsprint. I would put stains, like I'd have coffee stains on them, or I would have like handwriting on some of the old pages, because if you look at old comics, it's really common to find kids would write their names on the cover in pen or crayon or marker. And so I would do that. It was like whatever I could find that sort of gave it that aged look. It wasn't always just the traditional printing, but it was also these little details of like, oh yeah, some little kid carried that around in his pocket and didn't want his friend to steal it and, put his name on it.
Yeah. Those little artifacts. That's cool. You just blew my mind. Like you were doing this through, all this time, I work a lot with like trying to emulate this stuff through brushes, like, creating different halftone brushes and stuff like that. And then, coloring in channels and then manipulating the registration and stuff like that. But I'd not thought of creating a scanned library, which is so dumb, because I do have scans of like textures, because it's like, cool paper textures, newsprint and stuff like that. And you like drop them on and multiply or soft light or whatever. But yeah, so that's such an amazing tip. You just like, I think you just opened a whole door for me.
Maybe I shouldn't have given that one away.
Well, that's a good point. Like, how do you feel about like trade secrets like that? Like, is there stuff that you feel like you need to keep close to the vest, or do you feel like, you're a teacher? Like,
I'm happy to share stuff with anybody, because a lot of people have shared stuff with me. Like, I don't know that I've invented any of these things, and I'm always grateful for the people who have taken time to answer my questions. And for the most part, other cartoonists that I've run into have been very generous in that regard. So I feel like, if there's something I do that you want to know about, I'm happy to talk about it, because what you do with it will be different than what I did,
Yeah.
and you can believe that if you're doing something I like, I'm probably going to try to do that myself. So be warned, I'm not just giving here.
Right. Right. No, that's cool. You see that a lot, I think, in comics and in other art forms where, especially when you have artists that collaborate closely together or are networked with each other, that there's kind of like a loose competition almost where you're kind of one-upping, but not really. Like it's not like you're trying to defeat the other person, but you're learning, and then it's kind of like a challenge almost, right? Like you're
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I mean, I think that's the history of art. Everybody's sort of borrowing from all these different places, and the challenge is how, do something that you haven't seen done before with it. We're all using the same building blocks, but hopefully we're building some different stuff and some new things. And I don't know. I mean, that's kind of my perspective on what I see as an observer, of somebody who seeks out spectacle and enjoys looking at it. That's usually what I see. You can kind of reverse engineer how things are made, but I think we're all using similar parts. It's just playing different songs or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and obviously, something I might do is gonna. I think any different artist usually is gonna be completely done differently, or it's all because we come at things from totally different points of view, and so I mean that's been my philosophy anyway, is like to share the information and say that, yeah, do better. I would love to buy your book. Go tell that story.
Yeah, exactly. I want people to make good comics. I mean, I was a reader first. I'm a comics fan, so push the limit. Show me something I haven't seen before.
How important to you then is the end product, like paper? I mean, when you're working with publishers versus when you're self-publishing, because like I hope that a lot of people out there got the Octobriana books. Those are really cool because you had like different paper in each one, and that's something I pay attention to because when I go look at comics in the store, sometimes it doesn't even have to be like a great comic. I'll just appreciate that they went the lengths of printing it on a nice matte paper or something.
Yeah, I've done a lot of work with the publisher Ad House Books. And Ad House Books is Chris Pitzer, who's an art director and works primarily in print. And so he published Aphrodisiac, that was one of our early collaborations. But he also helped me on Octobriana last summer, which, for
Oh,
anybody unfamiliar, I did a Kickstarter for Octobriana in 1976. And it is the world's first blacklight comic. And so that process started, I consider that retro, right? It's
yes, sir.
blacklight is often associated with the 70s. So I had this idea. I had done some screen prints with blacklight ink, with fluorescent ink. And I thought you could probably do that with an offset printer, and you would just, kind of use these spot colored inks that are fluorescent.
Mm,
And first person I go to is Chris Pitzer, like he's my print guru. So I went to him and I told him the idea and how I thought I would set up files and it would print. And he agreed, and he was like, yeah, let's do something like that. And then it was a matter of kind of like figuring out a comic book story that I thought would work well with that technique, so like
mm,
I want it all to fit together. Sometimes I get different pieces first. And in this case, it was almost like this production piece. But as you can imagine, paper is a big part of all of this stuff. The first printing of Aphrodisiac we did on a coated paper, but the
mhm,
end pages were uncoated. And whenever
right.
those books came back from press, like we had done samples and they looked good. The coated paper was not glossy or anything. It looked nice.
Right.
But whenever we saw the uncoated paper, I liked it better. So all the subsequent printings, we went with uncoated paper. So you're trying to make
Uh,
adjustments and trying to do the best you can to match up ideal paper with whatever you have in mind
hey,
for the printing. So I definitely don't know as much about that, but it is something I'm interested in, and I do my best to work with people who can fill in those gaps. With the Octobriana Kickstarter, one of the challenges was the fluorescent inks really didn't work digitally, and most Kickstarter comic
mm,
projects have a digital version, a PDF or whatever of the
mhm.
comic. And so I was trying to figure out, like, what do I do to give people their money's worth with the digital version of this comic that doesn't really reproduce digitally? And I made a retro colored version that looked like a book out of the 70s with that kind of like Aphrodisiac or like an old comic book. And in the process of coloring it again, I like the black and white. So I thought I'll make a black and white version.
Right.
I love black and white comics from the 80s.
This
So
one?
playing with that. And
I'm on that one.
yes. And what happened was people wanted print copies of those. And so
Ah,
I added that as a tier on Kickstarter, and I sold enough of them that I knew what my budget was, and it was enough to have them offset printed, which was awesome, because then the black and white comic, I worked with the web press. A web press is what used to print comic books and newspapers, and now they're not used as much. But I
mm.
found a web press that would print a comic book for me. So I got to make a comic book like the 80s black and white comic books that I love. I got to make one of those. And, you know, that's totally dependent on paper. It was printed on newsprint, using a technique that I wasn't sure I'd ever get to use. So, you know, I'm interested in that stuff, and it does inform what I'm doing. And then it's a matter of connecting the right project to those things. But, you know, you could argue those are retro, being able
Mhm.
to use a not outdated, but a process that really isn't used in most comic book production these days.
Yeah, sure. It's so funny you mentioned that about aphrodisiacs end papers, especially because when I pulled the book out this morning, I picked it out. I was like, "Oh, these end papers are so nice." And then the inside of 'em, I have a first printing, I guess, because it's coated paper. So I got to track down another another edition. But that's awesome. So as far as like the tools you use, I do want to talk about because now we're living in 2021, and the tools evolve over time. So I wonder what are you doing start to end? You know, when you're starting a book, you're doing layouts or making notes or whatever. How is that? What tools are you using when you go through that?
Okay, so I'm in the middle of a book. I'm nearing the end of my next book right now, and the what I'm doing is I had written an outline for it, and that's what I submitted to my editors. And the outline started out as just index cards, where I'm kind of writing like what happens in a scene. Maybe I'll expand that to a couple of cards if it's really important or detailed info. So I ended up with this outline that was like one sentence per page for like a graphic novel. And that's what I submitted. That's what was approved. So I kind of knew what I needed to get on each page, and, you know, making sure I have enough room to land it the way I want at the end, all of that stuff.
Mhm.
You know, it's all mapped out, but very loose. And then each page I would just approach like almost like a Sunday newspaper page, where it's like, okay, this is page one. I'm going to write it out, and I'm going to do layouts. And I do that part together. So I kind of know what it is. And I think about, you know, how does this work in 6 panels or 8 panels or one big panel? And I expand that one sentence that describes the page into maybe a couple of lines of dialogue, or I start drawing it right away. And I've been doing layouts. I make a template on my iPad, and then I just draw in Procreate, very loose layouts. You know, it's what people call thumbnails. You know, so
Mhm.
think of just a very quick scribble of about what I think goes on that page. And I go back and forth between the writing and art, and I keep refining those thumbnails until they get to a stage of what people in comics would call pencils. And at that point, I print that out on an 11 by 17-inch piece of paper, a pretty traditional size for American comic books. And I print it out in light blue, and then I ink right on top of that light blue.
Mm.
So I don't know if what I'm doing is exactly retro, but it's definitely in that traditional, like heavy line art kind of mode that comic
Mhm.
books traditionally were drawn in. And and then whenever I'm done with the line art, I scan that back in and I color it digitally, either in Photoshop, or if I'm doing a little bit more of a painterly approach, I'll move it back into Procreate, and that's where I tend to color if I'm doing something more painterly.
Mm. And you'd mentioned, was it Street Angel's Dog that you did all in Procreate, didn't you?
Yes. When I got the iPad, when I got my first iPad Pro, I I could recognize like this is amazing. You know, I do everything myself. For a cartoonist, that's a little bit unusual. You know, usually if you
Yeah.
think of Spider-Man, it's usually there's a writer, there's a penciler, an inker, a colorist, a letterer. I do all those things myself, and that was what I recognized right away. Like, wow, you could really generate a whole comic here pretty easily. And I had a chance to do the free comic book day for Image Comics, but I had a very short window to do it. And my goal was at some point to do a whole comic with my iPad. And it was like, maybe this is the one. And I just dove in
Oh.
and started doing it. And it was a great experience. It's really neat. You know, I'm sure most people watching this are familiar with iPads and Procreate, but it feels a little bit like painting in that you can add and subtract very easily. And that's quite different than like an ink drawing or, you know, I do work a lot on paper. I do these ballpoint pen drawings that are very unforgiving. So it's kind of nice to work digitally and be able to, you know, add and take away and rearrange and resize and do all of that. But Street Angel's dog, to your point, completely done on my iPad.
Do you think you'll be doing more of those, or are you gonna pretty much stick to your other process?
Um, I think I know what my next book is, and it won't be done on an iPad. It's very dependent on paper again. So after that, I'm not sure. I do like working on it for a million reasons, and I am interested in making more kind of like mobile friendly comics. And it makes sense to
Mm,
me that you would create those digitally. It's a fast tool. It's a very easy tool to work with. So I will be using it more. But I tend to use a million tools. I do
mhm.
things that, like when I was a kid and learned how comics were made, it was with this kind of pen nib, that you're dipping into like an inkwell, very antiquated. But I've done that a lot, and I still do that on some of the pages I'm working on now. I use a brush with ink. I do, pencil reproduction. So I tend to do a lot of different tools. Like for me, it's always the tool. And it's kind of like, if I have an idea for style, I start with the story and character, and then it's kind of like, well, what would flatter this story and character? And
Ah,
I mean, now I feel like I have tools that can accomplish any of that. It's changed
right.
so much. If you look at comic books, like in the 20th century, they have that black heavy line, and that was based on printing. Like you sort of had to have that black heavy line for printing purposes, and it's just not true anymore. So now it's like, yeah, draw in pencil, paint something, color pencil, like every tool works. And I don't say no to any of them. There's nothing that I've tried that I hate. So
Right. It's interesting to me that I mean, it seems like a lot of I mean, it still seems like I mean, you guys like you and Ed, you're still like carrying the torch for putting ink on paper, like on Bristol, where others are just like, oh, I can do that on Photoshop, or I can do that in my iPad. Um, do you for you, is it all part of is it like the process for you, like, because I mean, obviously you could create some of that stuff digitally
yeah,
nowadays.
for the book I'm doing now, I wanted the original art. That was a part of
Right.
it for
Okay.
me. And that could be something that I sell later. Sort of the reality of
Hmm.
making comics and making a living from them is these different revenue streams. And original art is definitely something that I've sold in the past. And I like those objects. If you saw my bookshelves, I
Hmm.
have like two bookshelves of artist edition books that reproduce the
Uh-huh.
original art. That's definitely, it goes back to my childhood and loving comics, because I can remember
Right.
I just wanted to figure out how to make comics, and it was before the internet was a thing, and before I could just access people or access information. It was hard to figure this stuff out. And when I first found like an original page of comics, original comic art at a convention, it was like unlocking all of these mysteries to me,
Hmm.
staring at that. It was
Yeah.
oversized, and I could see the lettering and like blue pencils and white out. And it really, it's a real nostalgia for me, that original art. And so I do like working on paper, and I like the breaks from the screen. Even
Hmm.
if I'm working on paper, I'm still coloring, I'm doing layouts, I'm, corresponding maybe with an editor, or typing a script. There's so much screen time that, like, when I get a chance to go stare at a piece of paper, it's really nice. Like, I like that. And it's always been a part of, when I started making comics in the early 2000s, I did graphic design as a day job. So like 45 hours a week staring at a screen. When I came
Hmm.
home, it was just this nice break where I got to draw on paper. And I like drawing on paper. I like that tactile sensation. I do those ballpoint pen drawings, and they're just this like meditative drawing process that feels really good. So, most of the reason that I work on paper is because it's an enjoyable experience. It might be a little bit faster, if I were working all digital, but speed isn't the only concern. Like there's a lot of reasons that I do this stuff, and there's a lot I get out of it, and I like working on paper. So as long as I feel that way, it's probably some part of my process.
That's cool. I've a couple of questions based on that, but one you're teaching at the School of Visual Arts, right?
Yes.
Um, and so you must be interacting with some young artists who are working in visual narrative,
Hmm.
probably a lot of comics in there.
We have comics, game designers, documentary filmmakers, animators. The program is it's an MFA in visual narrative, and it's
Hmm.
multidiscipline, and that's one of the richest parts of the program for me. Like whenever I started it, I've been there since the beginning. And so like it was expose yourself to all this other media and formats that I might not usually, spend time with. And it's been revelatory, like there's stuff from all those different fields that I think have made me a better cartoonist. But I don't know, did I get off
Yeah,
track on your question
no,
there?
no, I just wondered, like, it got me thinking about your experience where you said you went to a convention and you saw original art for the first time, and it was a big eye opener, I had almost the exact same experience while I was in, college, and there was an Eisner like, touring Eisner gallery that I got
Yes.
to go see in person, and it was the first time seeing, all this comic art, original comic art, and it blew my mind that it was, like, huge, and you could see the whiteout, all the mistakes, the erased pencil, the blue lines, and I think that for me, and it just, it took like it not that it took like guys like Jack Kirby down a peg or anything, but it made them human, and I suddenly it was like I could do this. This is amazing. Like why am I'm trying to draw like at the small size, and you can draw big and shrink it down, and but I wonder about younger artists like doing comics now, how they're what they're getting out of like, well, I if they're introduced to a device or something like an iPad and they never get that experience with big paper, it just makes me wonder like how that shapes people telling these stories in this format in the future.
Yeah, it's hard for me to speculate on that. It's hard for me to know what it's like, because I don't work that way. One of the great things that I found with teaching is like I'm exposed to so much from the students themselves that I wouldn't see otherwise. I often joke with students towards the end of the year about how like I'm sure I got more out of this year than you guys did, um, because we live in this world now. Like when I was a kid, video stores were an oasis for me. I grew up in the middle of nowhere in a small town, but we still had like 6 video stores at the height of that. And it was all these movies, many of which I'd never heard of. They might be straight to video or who knows what. But I would just spend hours looking at all of these things, and they all felt amazing. Most of them didn't live up
Yeah.
to the box art or the cool thing in my head when I'd read the description. But I would see
Right.
all of this stuff. I didn't have, like the internet. So I would hear about an artist, Jack Kirby, for example, and go to a convention once a year and it'd just be like, what Jack Kirby can I find or afford? And it was
Mm,
very random, the stuff that I was seeing as a result. Maybe I'd find flea market comics or something, but you take what you can get there. Those are Sergeant Rocks probably. It was very much up to chance. And so as we've gotten, into the 2021, very little, you could live your whole life and never be exposed to things via chance. It's always recommendations on what you've seen and AI and algorithms and all this stuff that are like, hey, you
right.
watch this next. It's the same, but with, 2 different actors or something. And I value that. Like, I want to see stuff that I don't know I'm missing. And that's one of the great
Mm,
benefits of teaching for me is I do work with these students for a year and they're all bringing different influences. Storytelling's so vast that I don't know that they're missing something if they're just working digitally or if they're, just reading manga or, coming from video games. Like, I don't know that they're missing anything. It's not, it's not obvious in what they're turning in terms of stories that they're telling in my classes. But it's so big, like we're all missing stuff.
yeah.
I may work on paper, but believe me, there are huge gaps in my knowledge and experience and what I've seen. So, I may be missing some tools in that regard too, but I think probably we all are. And, part of storytelling and part of what makes like relationships work is those gaps. Like your experience, your point of view, your perspective is totally different than mine. And we may overlap a little bit here and there, but I don't want to talk to myself, like I want those differences. And so like for students, I encourage them to lean into those things, like lean into the skills that brought them there or the things that they enjoy doing. And then identify the parts that are missing for whatever story that they want to tell. That's part of storytelling. It's part of figuring out like, okay, I've got to go scout locations if I want to set this, at some place and make it believable. And, almost everything needs some degree of research, and that research could be on a piece of software or a process or whatever, a historical event. There's lots of directions that research takes, and no art is perfect, so that's keep the deadline in mind and do the best you can.
Yeah, you touched on a bunch of awesome points there. I hadn't thought about how, I think you're like a couple years older than I am, but I feel like we grew up in pretty much the same era. And when we were kids, that content was curated by like the dude that ran the video store or the distributor that sent those movies to the video store. But now, yeah, now people are getting all their stuff mostly curated by algorithms and things. So yeah, the people connection must be incredible for these students to be able to talk to you and you to talk to them and but I imagine they're learning something from you.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope so. I'm
Well, I
trying,
got but on good
but I know I do
authority.
take a lot out of it, and it's every year. It's not like, well, I've been doing this for 10 years and now I know what's going on. That each year it's completely different, and it's because the students change. What they're bringing is just completely different, where their interests are. And sometimes it's I might know something that seems like the next step for what they're doing, or it's like I'm running to catch up with where they're at so
Yeah,
that I can be helpful along the way. But it all sort of it certainly puts things in my life that I would not find otherwise, and
sure.
usually that's a good thing.
Well, I was just chatting with the chair of Nathan Fox, the chair of your
Mhm.
program, and he let it slip that you're like the most popular professor in the program. So, you
See,
know,
in wrestling terms, from Cartoonist Kayfabe, he's putting me over. I appreciate that.
yeah,
Now I'm gonna owe him a
yeah,
drink the next time I see him, but that's good.
awesome. Well, I do want to also ask. You've done a lot of work written by other people, but it seems like more lately you're writing your own stuff. And I wonder how does that affect when it comes to making comics? Because does it are you more precious with what is happening? Are you more careful? Is it because I feel like you can be a little bit cavalier with other people's characters, like you might manipulate them more than you would your own, or vice versa.
Um, yeah, I mean, I try to do the best I can, whatever the circumstances are. I try to read something if I'm going to work with a writer. I try to read, ideally, the script in question.
Hmm.
Um, that's not always possible, but like the Plain Janes is one of my biggest projects that I've done in my life, and that was with a writer, Cecil Castellucci, a young adult writer, and I've worked with her for almost, I don't know, geez, 15 years or something when the first volume came out. And it was her first comic script, so I couldn't read a comic of hers, but she was a novelist, and I went out and bought
Mm.
like a couple of her novels and read them that weekend. And was like,
Oh
wow, she's
wow.
a really great writer. I'm in. So like I do try to gauge that part. Sometimes I'll take a job and it's based on time. Like I'd done Adventure
Mm.
Time comics for like a story arc. I think it was four issues worth of those. And it came at a point in my life where I had been doing a lot of other stuff. Like I was doing gallery shows and things. And I got to the end of a year, I don't know, 2013 maybe. And I had only done like 2 comic book pages. And it's like, I'm not a
Oh
comic book artist. I can't say I'm a comic book
wow.
artist. It had gotten away from me. And I was like, I'm doing more comics this year. And like right around the time of that declaration, the editor reached out to me and asked if I wanted to draw some Adventure Time. And I was very busy, but I did want to do comics. And that came up, and it was like, based on the page rate, I knew how much time I could spend on them. Based on my schedule, I knew how much time I could spend on them. And it worked. Like it was a perfect fit. And so I was like, yes, I'll do that. And
Wow.
part of the reason for doing it was because it just fit. I wanted to make comics. I didn't have a lot of time. If you're writing it yourself, it takes more time. If you're coloring it yourself, it takes more time. So that was something that just was like right place, right time. And so I was in. And Ryan North was the writer. I think he's a great writer. I think he's a great
Mhm.
cartoonist, but a very good writer. So I kind of knew like this is going to go well. The Adventure Time
Mhm.
characters are amazing designs and very fun to play with and to draw. So it all kind of fit well, for a couple of months and for where my schedule was. So different factors affect what I do. I've been lucky in the last couple of years that I have been able to just kind of do my own comics. That's my preference. I want to draw I want to write and draw the stuff myself. I think one of the great strengths of comics is one person can make them. That's amazing if you think about like all the different stories that we interact with, from visual storytelling, things like film and television. This stuff requires big teams.
Mhm.
Comics don't, like in a way I can kind of show you like it's almost like being John Malkovich. I can give you the vision that I have for this thing, assuming my craft lives up to it. But, there's still that potential to be like, I can make this thing. And there's something awesome about seeing like another person's work that way, I think, like really seeing that vision of something that if that person doesn't make that graphic novel, it doesn't exist because it's coming out of their head. It's coming out of their hands. It's totally unique to this creator. I love that about comics. So as much as I can, I do want to generate them myself, but I also like collaborating. There's lots of great writers out there, so it's the best of both worlds for me. I like kind of mixing it up, and sometimes, working on someone else's script is just the right fit for whatever conditions are, affecting my decisions.
That makes sense. This new project that you're just about to wrap up, is this one you wrote?
Yes. Yeah, I'm doing writing, drawing, coloring, lettering, design, everything.
Wow. So will this be your biggest project like that, where you did everything?
I guess so. If you consider Street Angel, I have a writing partner on Street Angel. So that's probably the thing that I've spent the most time with and made the most stories with. But I do have a writing partner for that. So doing it myself, I guess this is it.
Wow. It's cool. There's comments already in the channel trying to be like, hey, what is that book?
I can't wait until I can talk about it publicly. Believe me, I'm more impatient than anybody that wants to know. I'd like to tell them. So coming soon. I mean, I'm reaching near the end, so I assume it'll be announced relatively soon.
And it's an original creation, original property, not a.
I can't say that.
Maybe you can't say. Okay, all right.
Don't want to give anything away. Don't want to tip my hat.
Okay, sure. I do want to talk a little bit about style. I imagine young artists might ask you about style and defining your own style, and I think a lot of times it's probably something that you don't really realize you have, and it's just until other people point it out to you. But something that's amazing about your work is like you have this kind of chameleon-like element to, especially with like the covers you've been doing for Ed's book, where you're just like, yeah, I'm going to jump in and do this like Todd McFarlane or something. I wonder if you could talk about how you approach that, or I mean, it's you make it look easy. I mean, I can't imagine that it is actually easy.
Yeah, some of it's easier than others, and I'm not very good at guessing which ones are easier than others. I did a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1 homage, and I remember Eric Reynolds, the editor at Fantagraphics, was like, good luck with that. It's a lot of hatching. And I'm like, what? This is going to be easy. And when I started working on it, it was like, wow, did I come out with a different appreciation for those guys. And I appreciated them before, but it was like, that was a more challenging cover than I expected it to be. A lot of it's the same as like for the retro stuff. It's like, you just look, for like, especially the homage covers, I'm really trying to base it on specific artists, specific times. The compositions are based on their compositions. So it's a lot of just looking and seeing like, what's the detail that makes McFarlane, or, what, if I look at this cover really small, what stands out to me, like make sure you try to retain that part of it. And a lot of that's done in color and, trying to emulate color. So, I was really self-conscious about not having a strong singular style because I liked stylists. I love Dan Clow's work. Mike Mignola, I always think of as like a prime example of, he could draw a chair and we would all recognize that's Mike Mignola drawing a chair. And I think if you're a commercial artist, style is really important. People pay you to be you, and that style is the part that makes you who you are as an illustrator. So I think it's good if you have a style, but if you don't have a strong pronounced style, what are you going to do? Like I could just adopt something and then try to draw that way forever, or I could try to tailor things to projects and stories and characters and outlets. And so that's kind of what I've done. And it makes it very fun. I feel like if I get tired of looking at the screen, I have work I can do on my drawing table or with ballpoint pens or, whatever the case may be. But a lot of that is dictated by how I feel or what the material calls for, or if it's a commercial job, what the client is looking for, which can be challenging to have that conversation. Sometimes clients show up and it's like, they love, this cover or something. And it's like, what brought you to me? What are you looking for in this job? So, it's part of the fun for me, and it's kind of weird, but it's probably not the smartest business move for like a young artist. You
Mm,
probably would be better served by having a style that is identifiable and marketable.
sure.
But I might have more fun. I get to play
Yeah,
with a lot of different tools.
right. I've often wondered that, like, if, if and I've wondered if it's just a mindset for certain people. Like Mignola is a good example, and he obviously evolved to that
Mhm.
style,
Sure.
but I wonder if at one point they're just like, "I wanna do something different," and what do they do? Pick up a pen name or something, and, because it
You'll see
I just
artists
don't
will
know.
change, and a lot of times maybe they'll change tools. Like Robert Crumb inked a lot with a pen, like a rapidograph. And when he got into the 80s, there's a period where he was doing stories and he was using a brush. And I think it was because
Mm,
he wanted to sort of, be a little different, do something a little different. Um, it's interesting with stylists like that because they're still identifiable. Like Mike Mignola, you'll see him do watercolors. I associate his work so much with these heavy black inks, and yet he'll switch to something with no black inks and it still looks like him. So there's lots of tells, especially if you make enough art. Like I'm sure people can recognize my drawing, even if I think there's no style there is. it's
mhm.
it's it's sort of inevitable. The other way you find your style is just make a lot of work and then look at that work. You'll figure out your style very easily through that repetition.
That's dead on. So I probably will get in trouble with a lot of my buddies if I didn't mention Cartoonist Kayfabe, because
I
I
would give
gotta
you a hard
say,
time after this.
it it's almost like I would liken it to like wartime radio almost throughout this pandemic. Like when our grandparents would turn on the radio to escape whatever. That's just how it's been for you. Like going daily, especially being able to turn on and Ed and Jim, they're gonna talk about comics today. Take us to school. It's been incredible, and I don't know. I don't really have a question here, but I just
Well,
gotta. You guys are my professors. It's awesome.
that's super nice to hear. I appreciate that a lot, and I can tell you, I don't like to speak for other people, but I think Ed would agree with this. It's helped us too. We're self-taught as cartoonists. Part of the way the channel came together is we would travel to shows, sometimes 8 hours in a car, and comics are what we have in common. So that's what we would be talking about. And
Hmm.
I learned so much in those car rides, because there's a lot of overlap in what we've read. And then you get to hear like someone else's perspective on it. And in this case, someone else who's making comics, trying to do what I'm trying to
Hmm.
do. And it's very insightful. And so that's how the channel developed. It was like, why don't we record some of this? Why don't we, look at some comics and have these conversations? So it's been fun for us too. And especially in the pandemic, like having that kind of thing, we record once a week and we just record several episodes, but having that sort of stability of like, let's read some comics that we think are good this week. And then let's get together and talk about them. It's pretty light. It's very positive. It's definitely a celebration of comics. We love comics. So for the most part, it's like, check this out. And it kind of helped us, I think, keep our sanity. It definitely helped me keep my sanity through this lockdown. Um, but we've heard from so many viewers that have said some version of what you just said, JJ, and it does mean a lot. There are podcasts I listen to. When we started Cartoonist Kayfabe, a lot of our focus, or a lot of my focus, was, does the tech work? Can we actually make this video, and upload it and people can see it? And I didn't give that much thought to like, what's the reaction, or how do people feel about it? But as we started to hear from people that were into it, I was reminded of like podcasts that I love, where it's like, oh man, I'm a fan of this podcaster, or I want to go see them live or whatever. We started to experience that, and it's been kind of amazing because it just, there were other things that I was focusing on and just trying to like be prepared, make sure the lights are on, this kind of like little stuff,
Yeah.
and without giving that much consideration to like, oh yeah, what's the reaction going to be? And it's been awesome. Communities have popped up. People send us the comics they make, which I love.
Yeah.
There are so many comics. If you're a comics fan right now, it's sort of the greatest time in the history of the world. And we get to see a lot of stuff that we wouldn't see if not for that channel, because people are making awesome stuff and sending it to us, or they have a favorite comic they want us to talk about, so they send us one of those. But it's really a chance to see some stuff that it's a constant source of inspiration for me, because people are printing in weird ways and using different technology and different tools to draw with. It's mind blowing what comics are now. It's like when I was a kid and I got bored of Marvel and DC, and it's like, I want more of these alternative comics, or I want more, comics about people's everyday life, or, science or something. I couldn't have dreamed that comics would be the way they are now. Like, there are comics about everything. And it's just incredible, again, as a comics reader and as somebody that's trying to make comics. I can tell you, like, the quality of cartooning, I think, is far superior than it was when I was a kid. And especially with like young cartoonists. It's amazing. Like, believe me, there were not young cartoonists operating at the level that people are operating at today.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that we're probably seeing, it's like that one-upsmanship almost, where I think people are seeing what's possible and
Yes.
then achieving it, because you're only as good as like what is the status quo, I think. But you're dead on, and you guys are. I mean, I hope like you're doing something amazing for the entire medium. Like you're it's like really paying forward. Like like you just said, you are encouraging creators to make more comics. Like, I mean, you give the marching orders at the
We
end
do.
of every episode. It's either, read them or make them.
That's
But
right. One or the other.
it's
And both. You can do
working.
both.
It's working. You're like drilling it into, and I can tell you personally, I was in comics a few years ago and did some graphic novels and some stuff for Boom, and then got kind of sidetracked by like doing licensed children's books and doing more commercial illustration. But like watching you guys and listening to like very like-minded individuals, the things that you're interested in, the tastes you have, the violent Rambo style 80s movies and wrestling and gore and horror, but also funny stuff. I mean, it kind of opened my eyes that I can create that kind of stuff too, whereas I kind of felt locked in almost to being kind of like I made a lot of all ages stuff, like that was kind of like where my career was going. But seeing like the stuff, I was like, these guys are really into the same thing. I want to make a book where this happens to that guy or whatever. And so, I mean, I'm making a comic right now that's totally inspired on that revelation. That like I can make a book that I would actually love to make, and
I
but
think it
anyway,
makes a difference. I think that you find the thing that you want to do, and you enjoy doing it. I think that comes across. It might be the thing that makes you want to spend an extra half hour on that page and really, really make it sing. I think it makes a difference, if you're enjoying what you're doing, and you see it in examples. We mentioned Mike Mignola, but like Hellboy, when he started Hellboy, nobody knew Hellboy was going to be what it was. It was kind of like him just going for it. Like, I want to do I like drawing monsters. Let me do a monster book. It was him doing the book that he wanted to do. And, lo and behold, that made a difference. As good as he was before that, it feels like that really was a level up whenever he just leaned into the stuff that he loved. And, there's lots of examples of storytellers that do that. And so, once again, like there are comics of all sorts nowadays, and by the way, I'm grateful that all ages is a popular category in comics now. It's given me hope that I'm going to make it to retirement, because it's a new generation of readers. But man, in the 90s, it just didn't exist. Like, comics were almost totally in the shadow of Watchmen and Dark Knight, all the 80s stuff, grim and gritty. So in a way, I think we may have lost a generation there, but the all ages stuff, it's so awesome to see. Like, now you have readers that just, it's everybody. It's very encouraging, because at the end of the 90s, comics were not very healthy looking in America. Readership was very low. There weren't a lot of choices, and things are much different now. So
yeah, it's cool to see you guys have such vast interests and reassuring. That's like, oh, it's cool to like this manga, and it's great to like that weird horror book, and this one that's not drawn so well but tells a great story.
Right, exactly.
So yeah, you guys are killing it. I hope you keep doing it. I could go on and ask you so many more questions, but I better open it up to the audience here. I think we've had some some questions come up, but if you guys got questions, float them in the chat. One person asked, who did the amazing Ninja Turtle painting behind you?
That my wife found that on like our Facebook neighbor group. Some kid did it and wanted $1 for it. And my wife showed me the picture on Facebook, and I was like, oh, that looks good. Yeah, go get that. give that kid $1. And she brought it home. It was a little picture online. I thought, oh, that's a little, marker drawing or something like that, but go encourage him. She brought it home. It's like a 16 by 20 acrylic painting on canvas. So we ended up giving him quite a bit more than $1. But it's just, I don't even know his name or anything, but I just think it's a cool image. So it's picked it up during lockdown. It was an exchange, like in a mailbox kind of thing. And I dig it. I think it's really cool.
Well, that is awesome. Another question I got from one of our other channels is asking, do you ever create your own brushes in Photoshop or Procreate?
I haven't. I may have very, very early on in Photoshop, like years ago, but I can't remember the specifics of why I did it. It would have been for some effect, probably some pattern or something that I was trying to create, but it's not something that I've done.
Interesting. Do you download like libraries of them and use anybody else's, or do you kind of use what's stock?
I mostly use stock. Occasionally I'll download some brushes from somewhere, like usually if I meet somebody at a convention and they have brushes or whatever, and they'll be like, oh, here, download these. But it's not something, it's definitely not my focus. I tend to use a few brushes that work, like a magic marker brush, and Procreate is one that I have fun with.
Oh,
but
really?
it depends, I may use an airbrush if I'm trying to do a gradient or something like that. But I use like pencil, a lot of times I use, I think there's a technical pen under inking, maybe. I'm so bad at this, but the brushes are not something I focus on a lot.
Brush designers everywhere are just offended right now.
Yeah.
Let's see. Eric wants to say, you've obviously got eclectic tastes, but are there any comics you dig that might surprise folks?
You know what? There is. One of my favorite comics is called Jane the Fox and Me by Fanny Britt and Isabelle Arsenault. I think they're Montreal. I think they're Montreal Canadians, and they're primarily like picture book creators. But they've done a couple of graphic novels, and the one that I love is Jane the Fox and Me, and it's about this like middle school girl who's struggling through middle school, like not getting along with her friends or her mom. And she imagines her brothers as like her little brothers as ninjas. So like they run around the house, creating more havoc in her life. And Jane is Jane Austen. She's reading, and it's beautiful. Like the artwork, what attracted me to, I almost bought a French edition of it because I bought it from the Beguiling in Toronto, this great comic shop. And I fell in love with the art. I was like, I'm taking this home. And they're like, do you want that in English? So I was like, yes, please, I can read it. And it turned out to be a really good read. But definitely the art is what really drew me to it. And it's primarily pencil, although I think there's some mixed media in there. It's very muted palette, but it's absolutely gorgeous. Like Isabelle Arsenault is the illustrator for it. And I just fell in love with her art, and the story, I found it very enjoyable as well. It's just a total package for a graphic novel that I did not know them. I was not familiar with it. It was buying it off the shelf randomly, but have fallen in love with it. And I thought I had it handy. I was going to hold it up, but I don't see it right here. So unfortunately I can't pull that out, but it's definitely, kind of different. It's probably more in line with like the young adult stuff. And the more like when I was working on Plain Jane's, I was reading young adult and looking at young adult, to try to understand that and kind of the language of that genre a little better. And so, yeah, I mean, I do, I guess, have eclectic taste. Like I like everything. The other book that I've really enjoyed is Eleanor Davis's The Road, A Bike, The Road, and Me, I think I think I'm butchering the name of it, but it's a graphic novel that she drew while biking from like New Mexico to Georgia, and she would draw at night. And it started out like I follow her on Instagram. She's an amazing cartoonist and illustrator. And she was posting like these drawings at night, and it was like this journal of her bike trips during the day. And they were beautiful. Like she just draws beautifully, but it's another one. If you look at it, if you think of us talking about Daredevil or something, this is very different.
Sure.
But really exceptional comics, cartooning, art, everything.
That's cool. I hadn't heard of those two, so I'll be checking those out for sure. Let's see. Alex wants to know if you've thought about doing a 24-hour comic.
I did one probably almost 20 years ago with a friend of mine, Jason Lex, and it did not turn out great. You know, it was silly, and I wasn't a very good cartoonist to begin with. And sometimes I think about doing another one. They're definitely interesting. Anybody unfamiliar, it's you sit down with 24 pieces of paper and you make a 24-page comic in 24 hours. I think one day a year is sort of like 24-hour comic day where lots of people get together, and they used to get together. Sometimes comic shops would host these. It's tough. I can remember my hand hurting really bad by about 20 hours in, the comic making no sense. So yeah, it's something that I would be open to trying again. And there are some good ones. Like some have been published. There's a French cartoonist named Boulet, Boulet, I think. And he does a lot of web comics. Every year for a while, he was doing these, he draws straight to ink. And every year he was doing these 24-hour comics. And some have been published in paper. I think AdHouse Books published one, but definitely a cartoonist to seek out if you're, well, maybe if you don't mind being intimidated by what he can make in 24 hours, it is incredible. But yeah, they're really interesting. You know, there's even rumors that Iron Man 39 is like the world's first 24-hour comic drawn by Herb Trimpe, and we made a Cartoonist Kayfabe video about it. So yeah, definitely something I think about. I don't know if I'll ever try another one or not, but probably. Hopefully, if I die of old age, hopefully I'll get another 24-hour comic attempt there.
Oh, we hope so. Do you have any advice for getting a first comic off the ground?
Yeah, I do. You want to finish it, and what you don't want to do is redraw page one over and over and over and over. So I would look at it as a draft. It doesn't have to be perfect, because if it does, you're out of luck. It won't be perfect, even if you take 50 years to do it. Do the draft, like make yourself get to the end. When I started doing comics, I would do shorter comics because it was just easier to finish a 4-page comic or a 2-page comic or an 8-page comic than it was to do a 300-page graphic novel. So I would say, whatever you're comfortable with or think you're comfortable with, go for that. But whenever you're starting out, you will improve quickly. I say half of what I learned about making comics, I learned in my first mini comic that I made. So you want to get to that finish line, and, you want to look at it, if it helps, look at it as a draft, but rather than redrawing the page that you're unhappy with, draw the next page and keep going. And whenever you're totally done, if you want to, keep a list of things that you want to change next to you, but don't do that list until you get done with the draft, because it is tough to get to that finish line. And, once you have all those pages, you might look at that page you were unhappy with a month ago. It might look different after a month.
That's great advice. Let's see. Is there any chance of a second issue of Octobriana?
I don't have it on my schedule. I have plans through next year, so it's probably not going to happen within the next year. But I really like that character, so it's anything is possible, and I do like that character a lot. I wouldn't mind doing more with it.
This one's interesting. What was the print run on Super Mag, and are there going to be any sequels?
I'm so glad someone mentioned Super Mag. I loved Super Mag's one of my favorite things that I've done. I think I almost had a breakdown doing it. It was pretty challenging. The print run was, I think, 5,000. A sequel, maybe. Never say never. So possibly I could see something like that happening again at some point, because when we were talking about retro as a subject for this, JJ, I thought about Super Mag because the retro element is it's a magazine. Like, I went to school for design in the 90s, and it was post desktop publishing revolution. And the guys who led the way on that were like magazine art directors. They would get a computer up, put on their desk, and be like, this is how we're making the magazine next month, figure it out. And so it was quick, like you started to see those results. Like, they were sort of the front line of what does digital mean? And that's what I was looking at when I was in school. And that's what we were all sharing and talking about. And it was so exciting, magazine design. And it kind of went away. Magazines just aren't produced in the number or volume that they were 25 years ago. And so I had a bunch of different work and some ideas of how that work might fit together. And I had done I art directed a print journal a couple of issues, and it was like, wow, is that like, it did not satisfy my itch to make a magazine. It empowered me to think like I could make a magazine, I could do this. And so that's what led to Super Mag. And I was so excited because it was a throwback to like a format that I had nostalgia for, from my younger days. And I still love magazines. So maybe a sequel. It's Super Mag was a really strange object for anybody that hasn't seen it. It's like a one-man anthology, something like that used to be common in alt comics, like 8-Ball, Dan Clowes and Julie Doucette did Dirty Plot, where one artist would draw maybe several strips in a book, and maybe they would be different styles or different characters. And that was what inspired Super Mag. So it's like a bunch of short comics from me, some illustration work, and just a chance for me to like, I don't know, show off, almost like a little mini portfolio, but with comics and a little bit of illustration and some design, some fun design stuff. So thank you, Brian. I'm always happy when somebody enjoys Super Mag because it's very near and dear to my heart. But I don't have that on the schedule either in the short term, but it's something that I love. So I'll probably do another magazine influenced project at some point.
We can hope. I remember when it dropped, everyone, all my friends in my little group, we all got copies and we're just like blown away at how awesome it was.
That's probably every trick that I know is in Super Mag.
We'll have to get it out and dissect it now. Let's see. When inking, do you know when to stop? That's a good question.
That is a good question. I don't have an answer for that. You get a feel for it. It's part of what makes somebody's style their style. If it's something that you're really kind of fixated on, I would say experiment. Stop whenever you think it's not done and just let it live for a while. Put it under in a drawer and look at it a week later and see if it looks different to you then. Knowing when to stop, whether it's inking, penciling, painting, any of those things, that's a big question. It's a good question. It's kind of like where ideas come from, in that I don't think there's a concrete answer for it. I know, I remember reading, and I think it's Kyle Baker, but that he would set a timer and, he would ink, let's say it was for an hour, he would set the timer for half an hour. And that would be like ink the most important parts, faces, or if there's details that are really important to this page, some effect, whatever. And then the timer would go off, set it for the other half hour, finish inking the page. So you're prioritizing what gets your focus, but you're also setting up like you have X amount of time to ink. Lorne Michaels from SNL, I always love, he says, they don't go on Saturday night at 11:30 because they're ready. They go on because it's Saturday night at 11:30. And when things are done, maybe it is a deadline. Some cartoonists try to do a page a day or a page a week. Having that kind of a deadline or like time frame, that can be a thing that lets you know when you're done with the page. I know that might sound a little bit weird, but it makes sense. It's made sense in my experience. You sort of learn to work at a certain pace if you approach it that way. And a lot of cartoonists, I can tell you, do that. If you want to do this professionally, the time is a really big piece of it. Knowing how long it takes you to do a job or will take you to do a job, and then doing the job in that amount of time that you budget. It's sort of linked to commercial art, and mostly comics are commercial. They come out of a commercial art background, at least.
That kind of segues into this question. We'll make this our last question because we're cut on time here, but how do you cope with family time versus comic making time when you're still working a 40-hour-a-week job?
I don't know that I coped very well. Time management, time balance, all of that stuff is another personal issue. I think it's related to health, and everybody's different. I don't have any children, so that's some time that, I don't need to devote to them. Man, that sounded bad. It's, what I'm saying is it's hard to make a statement, I think, about this, because even people change. Once I left my day job, my whole mentality changed. By the end, I really didn't want to be there. I wanted to be making comics, or I wanted to spend my time differently. So when I left there, like my whole mood changed, and it wasn't necessarily a big difference in how much I was working a week, but where I was working. So I try to balance. I try to be efficient whenever I'm working. I try to work the same schedule as my wife. So if she's, whenever she's going to be away at her job, I try to make sure that's when I'm working. That way, at least when she's home, I've already put in my, X amount of time. And then it just kind of varies. If I have sometimes jobs come up that are last minute that I really want to do, you sacrifice. Maybe you work one
Mhm.
weekend and in return you take a couple of days off. The next chance you get to spend time with my wife. So it's a balance. My wife works a non-traditional schedule as well, so she's a lot more understanding than maybe if she had a very rigid schedule and I just couldn't make that work. So we you make adjustments. You figure out what works and what doesn't, and you communicate about them when they don't, and do your best to improve that. It's a work in
That
progress. I think I'm doing all
yeah.
right at the moment, but it's ups and downs.
It's probably gonna be individual, like, everyone has different family structures, and it's like you
I
said,
think
it's
the one thing I'd say about time management is figure out like when you're most productive or most
mhm.
creative or most energetic, and try to align the more demanding tasks with that. For me, that's doing page layouts. Like that's the thing that takes the most like thought and focus and really concentrating. And I used to do it when I worked my day job. I would get up an hour earlier than I had to go to work and I would do layouts first. Like that's what I would do every morning because I'm a morning person. Like that's when I felt my best and was like, most in a concentration mode. And inking was something that I could do in a later time in the day. So like I would ink in the evenings, for example. So, like figuring out how you work best is something that you can adjust, and it's your process. Like don't be afraid to shift things
Yeah,
around if you feel like they're not working well.
that's great, thinking about, what is best for you per time of day. There's a book this guy Daniel Pink wrote not too long ago, where you figure out based on the laws. I think he's an economist or at
They
least
tend
knows
to
a
look at
bunch.
these numbers.
They look at numbers and they find the averages and they can kind of shift people into being like you're a night owl, you're an early bird, or you're this other thing, a kind of a hybrid. And based on those, what times of days you're probably most creative and what times of days you're probably good at doing kind of administrative, like mindless, systematic
Right.
kinds of things. And so if anybody wants to look that up, Daniel Pink, look up Time or Early Bird. I don't know the name of his book. I read the Cliff Notes version, but it was crazy. And he did some TED Talks about it too, which are awesome. But you look at those and that actually helped me quite a bit because I'm a night owl. So I figured out like, oh, I should not be trying to write emails to people at this time of night, and I should not be trying to be creative at this time of day. So it's worth looking into. But I love the questions. I'm sorry we can't answer them all. Um, but taking care of yourself is a good segue. I just want to mention really quickly because I'm duty bound because I'm part of the company. This panel has been sponsored by Sketchboard Pro. It is an iPad stand, and Jim's getting one pretty soon.
I'm
It's an
excited to try
iPad
it.
stand. You can drop your iPad into it, and it makes it a straight level playing. And it's modeled after the old art boards that we grew up using in art school and in drawing classes. Right now, we're doing a promotion where if you use the code Lightbox21 at sketchboardpro.com, you'll get 15% off free shipping in the US and most of Europe and in the UK. It's great. You use it in your lap. It makes things more comfortable. We invented it by accident because we were using them at our studio, and we all adopted iPads and we were using them on drawing. It got to where we were taking our iPads and we were just like resting them on our Cintiqs. And so our Cintiqs were these expensive iPad stands, and because we were doing more and more of our work on these things, because as you mentioned, Procreate's amazing little app, and it is a rewarding thing to draw in. So yeah, you can drop it in one of these. You can use it on a drawing table much more nicely because it puts your iPad up higher. You can pop out the legs and use it on a table, take it to the couch. And we're also, before I forget, I almost forgot, we're giving away two right now. Let's see. So if anyone, let me put it up here. Okay, special code, make more comics. The first person in the US to check out with that code will get a free Sketchboard Pro. So put the Sketchboard Pro any size in your cart, throw that in there. You get a free $120 value. And then we're giving away one to the rest of the world. So if you're international, there's one in the US, one international. make more comics, we'll get you a free Sketchboard Pro. And of course, if you try to use the code and it doesn't work, it's because someone beat you to the punch. But we still have that Lightbox 21 code that you can get a discount. But yeah, I want to thanks so much, Jim, for doing this with us. Like I said, I could talk to you for hours just picking your brain on comics process. But I will we'll leave it at that. We have your free issue of Street Angel's Dog is available for download at the link in the description. We also have links to your Patreon and to your other social links and to Cartoonist Kayfabe as well. So everybody should be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. Definitely like, follow, and subscribe Cartoonist Kayfabe. It'll change your life. Guarantee it.
Well, thanks everybody that came out. Thanks for inviting me, JJ, and thanks to Lightbox. This was great.
All right. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.